Welcome back to Dispatch Faith. I'm your host, Michael Reneau. Joining me this week is Amanda Held-Opelt. Amanda is a writer and also a singer-songwriter living near Boone, North Carolina, and that's really predominantly the reason I wanted to have her on this week. Amanda and I actually met back in college. We both attended the same small private Christian school, and back then she was known more for her songwriting than her book writing, but she's developed over the years a keen talent for putting to words the experiences of those around her and helping us think more deeply about the world around us. I wanted to have her on this week because she has seen firsthand the destruction wrought by Hurricane Helene when it came through, and also the recovery taking place on the ground, and particularly how faith communities and even particular churches have played a role thus far in the recovery and will continue to play a big role in the recovery going forward. So, Amanda, it's great to see you again after a few years, but thanks for joining us.
Michael, thanks for having me on. This is actually a little bit of a full circle moment, I feel like, for us, because we really got to know each other in college doing, I believe, a hurricane disaster relief trip. So here we are again. I guess we still have hurricanes in this world. We're still doing the work.
Apparently those are the ties that bind.
Exactly.
Right. We went on a spring break mission trip to a small rural camp in Mississippi, helping them clean up after some storms and hurricanes came their way. So It's been a minute, but it's good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too.
I mean, let's just jump right in, Amanda.
Yeah.
A lot of our conversation will focus on the role that faith communities are playing and what you're seeing on the ground. But first, you live not very far from Boone, North Carolina, which is one of the hardest hit places following Helene coming through about 2 weeks ago now. Can you just kind of explain to us what you saw on the ground in the hours and days right after Helene passed through, and also kind of help us get an understanding for, what your community is like geographically, topographically, how the people there are connected?
Yeah, if you're going to understand the story of the storm, you really have to understand our topography and just how much the hills and the hollers and the rivers kind of play a role in our social fabric, kind of in our infrastructure. So yes, I live about 10 minutes north of Boone in a little community called Meat Camp, right along Meat Camp Creek. And, I think what a lot of people don't understand about this storm is that it had been raining for 2 days straight before Helene ever came in. And so that's why you see 3-day rain totals between 16 inches and 31 inches here in Western North Carolina, because it was 2 days of flooding before Helene came. And so, we really felt like, all of my friends are saying to one another, we just didn't really feel fully prepared for what this storm was going to bring. I would say it was maybe Wednesday. The storm hit Friday. It was Wednesday when they started using terms like catastrophic floods, 100-year floods. And so all of us were like, okay, well, we've had flooding here before. We know which rivers rise. We know which, areas of town to stay away from when it rains a lot. But this so far exceeded our expectations of water rising. We have a little creek that flows kind of in front of our house and down the hill. We were fortunate in that our house is up a hill and we have a lot of granite behind us. So we weren't affected by mudslides. We weren't affected by the rising water, but we were watching that creek water rise, and it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And the worst of the rain really came in overnight Thursday night. And so it wasn't like you could kind of watch it overnight and see, oh, you know what, I need to move to higher ground. By the time people woke up on Friday morning, the water was upon them. And I have friends who ended up having to, carry their children over their head as they just crossed this, tiny creek that had become a raging river just to get to higher ground. And so, I think that was what was so difficult, is just you're watching the water rise. My husband and my 2 kids and I live in a relatively safe place in terms of our distance from the water. Power goes out. Communication goes out. Most of us use wells here in Western North Carolina. And so when the power goes out, you lose your pump, which means you lose your water. Obviously, we've all heard about Asheville. The city water there is still off, still not available. So all that to say that there we were sitting in our house on Friday, completely dark. It's dark of no communication. We're in the literal dark and trying to think, what do we need to do? Can we even get out? So we drive down, I now know, now that I've thought about it, that I crossed 7 creeks on my way from my
Wow.
house into town, 7 different creeks. And so the very first bridge we came to get out of our neighborhood had been compromised. There was a chunk of it missing. So there we were thinking, okay, is this safe to cross? We stood there with 3 neighbors and said, should we cross this and try to get out into town and try to check on my parents and check on our friends and get to a place where we have water and food? And we ultimately decided to cross that bridge, what was left of it. And as we drove into town, just the devastation was hard to fathom. Everywhere that there is a body of water, again, whether it was a creek or a river, that river had just risen just exponentially beyond what we had ever seen before. And so, yeah, in that immediate aftermath, I think the scramble was just to communicate, to find out if your loved ones were okay, to figure out where the power and the water was so that you could maybe go stock up and eat, give your kids a meal. We went through our shelf-stable food really quickly. Like, we're horrible preppers. Like, I learned that in this experience. I'm like, we are not cut out for the apocalypse. Like, we have nothing but noodles left and no water to boil it in. So yeah, that was kind of the immediate issue. And it took us 3 days to reach my aunts who live in Bakersville, North Carolina, about an hour south. And we actually ended up just having to drive there on very compromised roads to get to them, to check on them, to make sure they were okay. And they were, but that was a really frightening few days.
Yeah. I talked with someone who lives closer to me, and he made a similar comment. He said, I've never really been a prepper before, but buddy, I'm going to be after this one, I'll tell you that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So you all, I hesitate to use words like fortunate, but I mean, you all were able to get out of the way, and even I feel like crossing, as you said, 7 different creeks, was really quite the feat, given just how kind of wild every body of water around us was for the better part of a couple of days. You guys were able to get someplace with your parents and kind of hunker down for a little while in the immediate.
Yeah.
One of the challenges about where you are on the eastern side of the mountains, where I am west of you guys, is just there are a lot of communities where there's only one way in,
That's
there's
right.
only one way out. Folks could not get to anywhere else if they really wanted to. We're recording this on Friday, 2 weeks past, 2 weeks past when the storm really blew through. What are you seeing in North Carolina in terms of folks still facing some of that isolation or trying to work their way out of the mess that the storm wrought?
Yeah. So I think I saw the latest data was there's a county just south of us that like 50% of their residents still don't have power. And so, that's a lot of people, and it's a lot of elderly people. We have an aging population here, and it's not just like, well, they're out of power, we'll probably get it in a day or 2 days. Some people are being told that they may not have power for 2 months just because of the remoteness of the location. I'm so glad you mentioned kind of that access issue, because in most places it's like, well, the main road that you use to get somewhere, well, you just take the long way, you just go around. We don't go around here because there's a mountain in your path. There's some, for many communities. Our neighborhood's a great example. We have 2 access points, and they both cross a bridge, different creeks, and both of those bridges were compromised. One was not passable, and the other, the one we chose to cross, was, like I said, compromised. And so that's how there's 60 homes just in our neighborhood. And again, we live pretty close to Boone. If you talk about, I've told people, look at a map of Western North Carolina and East Tennessee and put the topography filter on, and look at all those bumps and all those creases. Well, all of those creases represent a cove or a holler that is home perhaps to a community with one road in and one road out. It's probably a gravel road, and it probably crosses a creek at some point. All of those creases represent communities that are cut off. Now, what we're seeing now is really miraculous, I think, in terms of like our road recovery. We've had a tremendous support from the Department of Transportation, from other states bringing their infrastructure workers in, and frankly, from regular citizens that have become structural engineers in the last 2 weeks. Like, I've heard of so many neighborhoods where, they have a small bridge that crosses the creek. They just built the bridge themselves. They repaired it themselves. And so it's both the neighborliness along with the kind of federal resources and state resources resources working together. So some of those access points are finally being mended, and we're finally getting up into these places. But for 2 weeks now, what you've had is really just communities taking responsibility for one another. Maybe you have one person in that community up that road that's been cut off. They have an ATV. Well, they're finding their way to get, around through the woods on that ATV to get to the local fire station, load up that ATV and take supplies up to the rest of their community. It's been really, really inspiring to see just how these kinship and kinfolk networks have really played a role in people's survival through this.
Yeah. So in talking to the folks I've spoken to, both in Western North Carolina and in East Tennessee, and I think on our side of the mountains, we got terrible acute flooding. The farther northeast you go into Tennessee, the long range effects or long term effects I don't think are quite as kind of cataclysmic as what they seem like they are in Western North Carolina. I think that's a function of how much more rainfall you guys got, even though you're not that far away from us, but you guys got far more rainfall than we did over that event. But one of I know there were helicopters flying into the mountains of Western North Carolina within 48 hours of everything kind of clearing. I reported for the Morning Dispatch earlier this week that where I live in Greenville, Tennessee, we have Chinook helicopters and Blackhawks flying overhead multiple times a day. It's just part of what you hear, just like a train rolling by now. It's a very odd
I watched a plane refuel mid-air the other day. I was like, oh, I didn't know they could do that. It's like a helicopter. It's wild what we've been able to see. Yeah.
And until things like that happen, I mean, until some of these resources got here, and even beyond, again, because of the isolation, it's, people, a lot of online discourse about FEMA should have done this, FEMA should have done that, the federal government should have been there, should have been there, should have done this, should have done that. It really felt, as you put it, local communities and little pockets, hollers, as they're called, taking care of each other. The two things I noticed, and I want to hear if this plays out for you too, the two things I noticed in talking to folks were, one, whatever church or churches were in these little communities, that in many cases became the nerve center. And you've got now pastors of these often small small churches, small congregations. You've got pastors, because they know their people and they know their people's people even. You've got pastors who are figuring out, they become quartermasters. They're trying to figure out how to get, material from here to here, and who actually can do that. You've also got volunteer fire departments in the places that have them doing the same thing. They become these nerve centers for volunteers to congregate, to come get a meal, to take MREs or whatever, pallets of bottled water. They become landing zones for people flying stuff in. And I mean, I these stories are kind of well documented, 2 weeks into this ordeal. The question I would have for you is, just from your own experience, and you've taken part in some of this stuff, is why? Why do those particular places end up being, like churches and volunteer fire departments, why do those particular places end up being the nerve centers and kind of ground zero for helping these communities?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is fire departments and country churches. Fire departments and country churches. They have their finger on the pulse of what's going on, who needs what. And it's been honestly so inspiring to see, because I've heard from the media, and I've heard, that the word on the street is that small country churches, small rural churches are in decline. And that may be so if you look at some, data points. But what I know to be true is that for decades, I mean, these small country pastors, they have never given up on their flocks. They've been in the community. They've been faithfully teaching in their congregations. They've been serving their congregations. And all of that quiet labor has met this moment in a very powerful way. Because even if, the daughter of their parishioner grew up and isn't going to church anymore, he knows who that daughter is. He knows the grandchildren of the parishioners that are still present in his church. And so what I'm seeing is, I mean, I'll tell you about one church in particular, Meat Camp Baptist Church. It's been there since the 1800s, beautiful old church up on the hill. Pastor Townsend's the pastor there. And when I rolled up into that church parking lot, it was a full operation. They'd turned their fellowship hall into a store, essentially, where everything was free. You come in, you get your winter coat, you come and get your tuna fish, your bread, whatever you need. And they were serving hot meals. And he was literally loading an ATV up with hot meals for this woman to take up into the holler where there were some elderly people that had no power, had no water. And I have never seen that man more alive before. I mean, it was like he had been waiting for this moment to pour out and minister in his community. And so that to me has been the really inspiring thing to see. And I think you have to know a little bit about the history of Appalachia too, to understand how this is all functioning. Is that you have what you have is for centuries, these families would settle into a holler and into a cove, and they would kind of build this kinship network in this valley, in this cove, in this holler. And so much of those communal ties remain intact. There's this sense of responsibility for your neighbor. There's this sense of like, you don't leave your fifth cousin behind, you know what I mean? And I think that is really proving to be kind of one way that this particular region, this particular demographic in Western North Carolina is riding out and surviving this disaster and even thriving in some way in the midst of this disaster that you might not see in an urban context, or you might not see in a city where there's more transients and maybe the person who lives next to you, but you don't know every person on your road. You're not related to everybody in this valley in some form or the other. And so it's these kinship ties are really the things that are making it so no one is forgotten, no one's unaccounted for, no one's going without supplies, because your neighbors, your kin, your relatives are looking out for you. And again, those churches are the hub of the wheel. Those fire departments who know their people are the hub of the wheel. And that's kind of how people are getting through this.
One of the timing of all this is interesting, just because we've, a month ago we were talking about Haitian immigrants in Ohio and the selection of J.D. Vance as Donald Trump's running mate. And of course, everyone, kind of hearkening back to Hillbilly elegies from 7 or 8 years ago. And we've done that at the Dispatch plenty too. I mean, it's all kind of fair game to kind of look back at some of that stuff now. But I just wonder, I mean, you wrote earlier this week for Christianity Today about home place and kind of what to do with all this tragedy and kind of what to do with challenges and trials like what this region is seeing now, and the importance of home place. And I'm just wondering if, a situation like this either props up or dispels certain perceptions, or maybe they're misconceptions, misperceptions about this region that kind of, a lot of this stuff gets flattened out in the course of the political conversation, the political discourse. A lot of these nuances get flattened out, and then you have these caricatures or cliches that develop around, what it means to be a hillbilly.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what do you think? I mean, will there be any lasting understanding of this region? And even just what you unpacked, it's not that people just move to a holler or move to a cove because they want to escape everything else. That's often true, but a lot of times it's because they are getting back to a home place. You're getting back to a place where the land has meaning to them and connection, even in their bones, so to speak.
Yeah. And I use the word hillbilly not in a pejorative, but with a lot of pride. And I use the word redneck with a lot of pride and not as a pejorative. And because I do feel like the hillbilly stereotype is one of the few stereotypes within kind of the American imagination that's still fair game to kind of poke fun at or denigrate. And I hear a lot of comments of, you see things online in the aftermath of something like this. Well, hillbillies deserve it. They chose to live in isolation out there, or, they always vote against their own interests, so they don't deserve help from the government, and all these things. There has been a centuries-long campaign to create a sense of otherness in terms of the Appalachian people, to denigrate them, to portray them as less educated, as feuding violent people as ignorant people. And that was an effort that was kind of the charge in that effort was led by coal companies who really wanted to disenfranchise people out of their land and make it a little bit more palatable for the public by saying, well, these are poor people anyway. They're lucky to have a job in coal mining. And obviously the entertainment industry has really tapped into those tropes and tapped into those stereotypes. And what I hope we have the opportunity to show is that, first of all, Appalachia is not a monolith. We are not all redheaded Scots-Irish people. There's a lot of racial diversity here. There's cultural diversity here. There's diversity of belief, political, religious, all of those things. But there's also an incredible resilience that I think that is kind of embedded in the DNA of people who live here. It takes a certain kind of, I think, grit to live in the mountains. It's a harsher environment. It's a less predictable environment in terms of weather and accessibility. And what I'm seeing when I go into these hollers and when I go into these kind of more rural areas are people, they don't have power, they don't have water now, but they're living off the land. They're living out, off the garden, the tomatoes and the vegetables from their gardens. They're eating those. They're living off the canned goods that they canned themselves. They canned their own vegetables from their gardens. They're bathing in creek water. They're washing their clothes in creek water. They're drinking water from the spring. They have this kind of, I think it's a generational memory in some ways of the ability to kind of make the land work for you. This land that kind of turned on us 2 weeks ago, we're now able to say, no, I'm going to use this land to help me survive. And you couple that with these centuries old kinship networks that make it so that neighbor is helping neighbor. I hope that the world has an opportunity to see just the grit and the resolve, the survival intelligence that the people here have as maybe a bit of a model for how we can endure through some of these climate disasters that are coming our way. I hope it's an opportunity for people to see the neighborliness, the ingenuity, the industry, the resourcefulness of the people here, because it's been truly inspiring. And I hear that from linemen that are from out of state, from infrastructure workers that are from out of state, are saying it's been a powerful experience for them to be here because of how kind the people are, how generous they've been with their resources, how grateful they are, and just how, like, I don't want to downplay the need and say, well, we don't need anything. We got veggies from our garden. But what I'm saying is that just the fact that they're actually surviving in this catastrophe in a way that I think displays a lot of dignity. So that's my hope, is to kind of dispel some of these tropes that were not made better by Hillbilly Elegy. That book relied on a lot of these traditional tropes of the feuding hillbilly, of the ignorant hillbilly, of the poor hillbilly. That's just not how things are here. This is a rich place. It is a place rich in resourcefulness and culture and kindness. And that's what I hope people see.
It strikes me as you making the point about coal companies, and that's a whole other conversation we could have about the history there, and even entertainment industry, playing up tropes and playing up stereotypes, that sort of a thing. There's a temptation, I guess, sometimes for folks who point those things out, and I think rightfully so. But there's a temptation for the pendulum to swing so far that this region, the folks who live here, kind of lose their agency. Mm-hmm. They become only victims, mm-hmm. And it's just the circumstances of their victimhood and the people making them victims are just slightly different than other similar narratives for other similar groups. Everything that I have seen happen, everything you've seen happen that you've described, it really, I think it dispels the notion that there is no agency. That's not to say there aren't challenges and there aren't problems, in this region, just like there are challenges and problems
Absolutely.
in California or the Mountain West or New England or whatever. Not to push those under the rug, but I think this whole ordeal, it removes the idea that you can believe this region has kind of been kicked around a little bit in the last 150 years without thinking that, saying that removes all human agency and the ability to actually work towards something. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, if you talk about like agency, it was striking coal miners in West Virginia and Kentucky and Appalachia that, it was the largest armed resistance in the labor movement, the Battle of Blair Mountain. And it was the kind of the endurance of these striking coal miners that created the middle class in America. They've shown a lot of agency and again, just pushing back against their oppression and marginalization over the years. And you're absolutely right. It's a complex culture here. I think it's Silas House says something like Appalachia is both a wound and a balm. There are obviously like challenges here. There are problems here, just like there are in every region. But what I don't like is for it to get flattened out and reduced to kind of the most insidious stereotypes.
Sure. One of the things you and I have talked about in the last couple of weeks that's going on is you've got a very large relief organization that you have spent a lot of your years working for, Samaritans Purse. A lot of folks will know Samaritans Purse because of Franklin Graham and the political connotations and implications therein. But when it comes down to it, Samaritans Purse, the organization's bread and butter is finding places that need kind of the things that you've highlighted and figuring out how to meet those needs, and not just meet the needs itself, but also helping folks on the ground get back up to where they can meet those needs themselves. Not just to be subsistent. But you've been to a lot of different places and done a lot of interesting things in your life. But Samaritan's Purse, headquartered right there in North Carolina, is now working in its own backyard. And since you spent, I think you said 10 years working for Samaritan's Purse, what is that like for you to see that happening, like literally, across the way from where you put your head down every night to sleep?
Yeah. I worked for them for 10 years. I haven't worked there in a few years, but yeah, to see, normally they are responding to disasters all over the world from this little headquarters in Boone, and to see them actually basically flying helicopters from the airport is actually right next to the Samaritans Purse headquarters, flying helicopters to their neighbors just from their front door, to see that a lot of the folks that normally are the disaster responders around the world actually lost their homes or had their homes damaged in this storm, but they're still showing up to work every day to help their neighbors. And it's great because in a lot of ways they're really cut out for this kind of work. They already are thinking about winterization. They're already thinking about water filters. They were thinking about that from day one. Kind of the nimbleness of the organization, their ability to get boots on the ground, to get supplies on the ground within 24 hours is pretty remarkable. And so to see them kind of run the disaster response from the headquarters, but the responses in their backyard has been pretty remarkable to see. I was just, as I was driving in town today, I saw a bunch of orange shirts, mudding out a home, cleaning up debris from a yard. Or their volunteers wear orange shirts, and they are crawling through every hill and holler of this area right now. So,
what other faith-based organizations? It's not just Samaritan's Purse operating right now, but what other faith-based organizations have you seen on the ground?
Yeah, Water Mission is doing some great work in this area. We're also just seeing a lot of churches, like churches big and small, that are showing up. Like I said, it's those country churches are kind of like the epicenter in terms of the supplies coming in. But you're also seeing larger churches like Alliance Bible Fellowship, my own church, The Heart, Cornerstone Summit. These churches are they've become disaster response organizations. Essentially, they have a few more resources than say some of these smaller churches, and so what they're doing is they're supplying the smaller churches from within their larger infrastructure, and so that's been really encouraging to see.
Once again, like coming to the question. So one of my friends, Terry Mattingly, who for years ran the Get Religion website, he's a journalist and covered religion as a journalist. And we've had him write some stuff for us at Dispatch Faith. But he and the folks he worked with at Get Religion called these religion ghosts, when there are these stories in the mainstream news or any news coverage for that matter. And there's this underlying motivation or underlying reason or something in the background that gets kind of lost in the translation of the news reporting and the writing or broadcasting, whatever it may be. And they call those religion ghosts. These things are just kind of haunting a story, but not really coming to the forefront. It's hard in this kind of situation. And folks can, say what they want to say about organized religion or evangelicals, who are, predominantly the ones in this situation in the South right now in this region. But it's hard just to when you see organizations coming to the front and churches in particular, it's hard to let those religion ghosts just be ghosts. I mean, they kind of bubble up to the surface, right? The motivation for all these folks doing this work is, I've talked to several of them. It's the faith they have, and the natural outgrowth of that faith in moments of crisis, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I understand. I have a lot of friends that have been hurt by the church, a lot of friends that have deconstructed and no longer part of organized religion, no longer part of the faith at all. And I'm stubbornly religious. I feel like not only is there truth in the faith, there's also just so much that society is able to benefit from a functioning church, like a church that understands its mission of serving its neighbor, of loving people selflessly. And so that's kind of, I mean, I want to sometimes say like, man, this region would be quite literally up a creek were it not for the local churches, doing what local churches are supposed to do. And so it's one of those things where like I said, like organized religion can get kind of a bad rap, but the organization of our faith-based communities right now is literally saving lives right now. And that's not something that we can ignore. I mean, like who steps into that role if the church is gone? Who maintains those communal ties? And it is the church. It is the church, and I'm so grateful that I've been able to bear witness it, because it's like, it's not only do I think my faith is true, I think it's good. I think it's good for this community.
Yeah. I want to ask you about a couple of things that are tied directly to that. They're a little bit apart from the flood recovery and the disaster recovery. Before we move on, just anything else that you would want folks to know about what's going on with regard to the recovery from Helene? For folks who are praying, what can they be praying for specifically, but other ways for folks to just be aware and be helpful to the whole situation. And we say all this too, knowing there's a whole other swath of the country now that's recovering from Hurricane Milton down in Florida that did major damage too. So if it's not on if it's not on your doorstep here, it might be on your doorstep elsewhere in the country.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, I think one thing I would just say, and I hope it's okay for me to mention this, but I think, this idea of conspiracy theories in terms of like, oh, the government's not here, the government's not helping. I want to assure you, I'm here, I'm watching it. The government is helping. Like, there has just been this incredible coalescence of neighbor to neighbor, nonprofit, and government resources that have come in to help and address the needs. And yes, it's painfully slow in some places, but I am in awe of how quickly things have been able to move forward. And I know sometimes people in this region may be apt to maybe buy into some conspiracy theories about the government taking their land because of lithium mines, or the government not being trustworthy. And what I want to say to the outside world is like, please, 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 let's not spread these false rumors or these conspiracy theories, because this taps into an ancestral wound, a generational trauma, where hundreds, decades ago, the late 1800s, the people of Appalachia were marginalized in this way. Big industries like extractive industries like coal and timber did come and take people's land through various nefarious ways. And so that fear that they have is kind of, again, it's one of those like in the bloodstream types of fears. And so they're particularly susceptible to maybe a conspiracy floating around about that. And so that's what I want to say. If you're not in the region and those are conspiracies that you're helping to kind of maybe spread or repost or things like that, it's doing great emotional harm to the people who are here, whose ancestors were taken advantage of in that way. And so again, they're apt to believe it, and it's not helping. We need everyone here to kind of have a posture of trustworthiness towards the resources that are coming in. Does that make sense? And so let's just tell the truth. Like, that one thing that would be helpful for Appalachians right now is tell the truth. Let's tell the truth about what's happening. Listen to the people on the ground. Listen to city managers. They're telling you who's coming in, to little town managers and chambers of commerce and all of that. They're saying what's happening. The government is helping. We're getting federal resources. We're getting nonprofits in here. We're making progress. And I want people to just tell that truth and tell that story so as not to exploit the very real fears that some of the people have here because of our history. And beyond that, I would just say, pray for our roads. Pray for the workers who are working on our roads and our power lines. That to me is the biggest thing, particularly in Northwest North Carolina, and certainly in Asheville as they're working to restore waters. We need these engineers, these bridge builders, these power folks that can work on power lines to stay safe. To have resupply of those workers, backups come in and help. We need our roads to be back intact. Our kids are still out of school; they can't run buses because the roads are still so compromised. And so I would say that that would be kind of my biggest prayer, the greatest need right now.
Sure. I'm struck by all the stuff with conspiracy theories, and even if, again, go back to a month or 6 weeks ago, all the Haitian cats nonsense coming out of Ohio. So much comes down to just tell the truth. And if you don't know what the truth is, maybe don't speak into a situation at all.
Don't share it. Don't share it.
So one thing I did want to come back to, I mean, like I mentioned kind of in the introduction, when you and I were seeing each other more frequently, you were known around campus as the singer-songwriter. We still have some of your albums, by the way, some of those very early albums.
Those are all on the black market now, man. Like those are
not here. I got a CD case.
Oh no.
But so you obviously music is still, or maybe not so obviously to some of our folks, but music is still a big part of your life. You spent a decade doing relief work with Samaritans Purse. And a few years ago, you became a writer, and I don't know, a writer of books, not just songs. I don't know if that was part of your plan 10 years ago or 15 years ago, was to move into that arena. But I just wanted to, have you talk to us a little bit about, you've released 2 books. One, A Hole in the World, written a few years ago after the death of your sister, who was, had written several books and was a fairly well-known writer in terms of evangelical writers. And then last year, I believe it was, you released Holy Unhappiness, your second book. So I just would love to hear more about this road that you've been on. Again, whether that was part of your plan 10 years ago or not. It's funny how things work out that totally catch us off guard. But what your work is about now, both in your words, but also your music.
Yeah, no, it was really my sister who encouraged me to write. I never thought I was a writer of the family. She was always the writer of the family. But she was like, no, I think you have a book in you. You ought to consider it. So my sister, Rachel Held-Opelt, we were working on a book together just shortly before she passed away. She was kind of helping me write the outline and things like that. And I just was like, I put it away and was like, I don't think I can do this without her. I don't think I can do this without her. But she spoke those words of encouragement over me to planted that seed that maybe when the time is right, that this could be a work that I undertake. I was really having trouble processing grief. I mean, I think most people who've experienced grief and loss, whether that's by natural disaster like we're seeing now or a personal loss, you find that you're kind of a novice in your own life. You kind of wake up to a life you don't even recognize when you have these significant losses. And I just had no idea how to process my grief. So I started kind of researching rituals of grief from throughout history, particularly in Appalachia. I was kind of interested. It's such an interesting culture here and how they used to mourn and how they used to grieve the dead. And as I was doing this research, COVID hit. This is 2020. And so I just started journaling my reflections after learning about, this is why they covered mirrors, or this is why they would stop the clocks when people died. And this is what they thought that meant. And I asked my agent, would it be helpful for this to publish a book about rituals is anybody going to read a book about bereavement rituals from the past, or is this just too niche? And she said, no, I think that could be really helpful. And so I wrote the book, A Hole in the World, Finding Hope in Rituals of Grief and Healing, about my own journey of grief and how the way our ancestors used to mourn and to grieve and have kind of this sense of permission to be in mourning, really helped me process my own grief. And it's interesting. I just got a message on Instagram of somebody up in Lansing, North Carolina, which is very hard. I don't know if you've ever been to Lansing. It's a beautiful little town that's kind of experiencing this kind of renaissance of arts and culture. And they had just built up this beautiful downtown with all these art shops and bakeries and things. And it was totally destroyed, flooded. And so I got a message from someone on Instagram. She's like, could I bulk order some of your books, A Hole in the World? Because there are a lot of people here who are grieving either loss of loved ones to the flood, loss of businesses, loss of home. And I was like, well, I got 15 in my basement. I'll bring you. So that's where I'm going next. I'm about to go take her a bunch of my books along with some food and some supplies and things like that. And then the book my sister and I were kind of working on ended up being the book that became Holy Unhappiness, which released last year. Kind of a book about the expectations we have of what the life of faith will feel like. And it's not often what we think. So
both those have maybe some particular relevance at the moment.
I think so. Yeah.
Given what else going on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm just real quick before we get out of here, what's, from A Hole in the World, what would be one kind of surprising, or unknown, obscure, forgotten, whatever, what would be one little tidbit that would be interesting to folks about how those in the past maybe grieved or dealt with grief?
Yeah. Well, I think one of my favorites is the ritual of telling the bees, which is this idea that if someone in the home dies, you have to go to the beehive and tell the bees, inform the bees of the death in the family. Otherwise, the superstition is that the bees will fly away or that they'll die. My husband's a beekeeper, so this was of particular interest to me. A lot of people in Appalachia keep bees, and so I think the reason I found that particular ritual, so many rituals are actually rooted in superstition, which to me is kind of it shows kind of our desire for agency when, someone dies and you don't understand how or why it happens, when there's catastrophe, when there's disaster, and you don't understand how or why it happens. You just want to fix it. You just want to make it better. And you feel so helpless. We're all so helpless in the face of death, right? We're so helpless in the face of these disasters that this one little superstition, well, if I just tell my bees that I won't lose my bees, that there's one thing I can control. You find the one thing that you can control, that you feel like you have agency. And a lot of these rituals are really putting into practice your own sense of agency in the face of the unknown. And I think that's why that particular ritual stands out to me.
Amanda, thanks so much for hopping on and talking with me and sharing with folks what's going on and your work too. If folks want to keep following you, how can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and what do we call that now? X, under Amanda Held-Opelt. And my website is just amandaheldopelt.com. I have a Substack. I've been trying to write updates on what's going on here, what I've seen in terms of the spirit of the people, the genuineness, the kindness, the resilience of the people. And I also write about grief. So I'm fun. I'm fun like that. Disasters and grief and unhappiness. It's not really a great brand. My husband was like, why didn't you write your first book about like the history of Ferris wheels or something like that? It's a better brand, I think. But yeah, would love to connect with folks.
Amanda Held-Opelt. Thanks. Thank you for coming on. It's great to see you again. We'll be in touch, but
awesome to
thanks.
see you too.